Typically, when I prepare for my sermons, I work through commentaries, which are collaborations of theologians giving reflection on the various passages. And I go through those looking for seeds or perspective. And then I get up here and I pontificate, sometimes for very long periods of time. Today, I thought I would do something different, reverse that. And so what today you are going to hear is actually much more from the theologians themselves. In fact, most of this sermon is a collaboration of theological voices and reflections on the passage of the prodigal son, with a little bit of me, mostly them, a little bit of them, me. So let us begin. He began in self-will. He was not wicked at first, but he was resolved to live his own life. The younger brother was not thinking primarily about the father or his brother, but himself. He could not claim that he was ignorant of life. No doubt he knew many stories of those who had gone off on their own for glory and excitement, only to stay forever, as if sitting at a bonfire staring at the light, enraptured by the flames of their own satisfaction. But he probably thought, like many before him, that his way would be different, that where others had become lost, he would find his way. He was convinced that being away from his parents, he would be able to do whatever he wanted, and this freedom would make him happy. It is the same with many of us, I'm sure. Many young people in this world today, they most likely become tired of being at home and desire to be free from parental control. When I was applying for colleges in 1993, assuming that they had the major of wildlife biology, I had two rules. I was not going to apply to a school that required me to write an essay. And I was not going to attend any school in Pennsylvania where I lived or any state touching Pennsylvania. And so I applied to Indiana, Wisconsin, Purdue, and Missouri. And I ended up going to the furthest one away. Now you can still drive there in a day, but it was just far enough to be away from my parents that I thought, I have freedom. Now, I didn't have an inheritance. I did probably spend too much of their money in riotous living. I am not the prodigal, but you quickly find that when we go on these journeys in life, it does cost money. And so in his working to find freedom, the prodigal demanded his inheritance from his father. Of course, without thinking about what it would take for his father to get that inheritance. Now let us be aware that what he asked was not totally out of order. For in fact, under Jewish law, a father was not free to leave his property as he liked. The elder son must get 2/3 and the younger 1/3, according to Deuteronomy 21. And it was also by no means unusual for a father to distribute his estate before he died, if he wished to retire from actual management of his affairs. But there was also a high probability that the father wouldn't have that much money just laying around and would have to sell some of the property and the assets of the family to get the money that this son wanted. So we see here a certain callous heartlessness in the request of the younger son. He in effect was saying, give me now the part of the estate I would get when you were dead, and let me get out of this. The father did not argue. He knew that if the son was ever to learn, he must learn the hard way, and so he granted his request. And in that moment we see our first glimmer of the father's graciousness, even in the face of the son's selfishness, as he grants the son's request. Certainly, the son is now happy, flush with cash, and on his way to paradise, not Missouri. He was willed himself a future. And yet, from self-will off in a far country, he continues on eventually into self-loathing. Of course, he could not have hated himself unless there was a good man within him to do the hating, but it was some sort of abject form of self-expression that led him to that far country to begin with, and there he would begin to despise himself. In reality, seeking himself and the world, he had in fact turned away from God, and therefore life began to turn against him. And thus we see him lose all the money, finding himself in the midst of a famine, and no one was willing to give him anything. He even became so hungry he would have eaten the food he was feeding to the pigs. Now, this is something for the Jewish people that would be an ultimate sign of degradation when Jesus told this parable. To associate with pigs was unthinkable and unclean. This is a turn in the story to show us how low, in fact, his life had gotten. And then, at his lowest, Jesus relates to his listeners how the Son came to himself. In other words, he awoke from his self-willing dream. The wording here in Greek has the sense of coming to after fainting, right? You wake up and you're not quite sure, and then all of a sudden you realize something happened. It shows us the truth that our selfishness is not reality, but instead is an evil dream from which each one of us must awake. And so the prodigal son realizes that he had been asleep in himself, and the life that he had sought and found and thought was real was so unreal that if he had followed it down the path any further, it would have become death. He had no real joy, no friends, no food, no inner peace. He had fallen so far from life that he now had more in common with pigs than he did with men. And so now his thoughts begin to turn to home. We should note as Christians that humans truly come to themselves when they are able to say in this life, "What a fool I have been." And yet we will so often never believe it even then, unless we say it out loud and keep saying it to each other and to ourselves over and over again. But here in this parable today, we do see reality awaken. When the prodigal came to himself, when he awoke and he turned homeward to the will of his father. And so alone and hungry with pain on the road toward death, his pain mixed with shame and longing for the love of his father, he turns towards home. But even more, he found in himself a deep realization of the nature of sin, and thus his need to confess that he had sinned against heaven and before his Father. This, my brothers and sisters, is the conversion in faith. To face oneself, to stand upright in the midst of trouble and sin of life, and to go forward offering repentance to our God in heaven. And so this parable is thus a final and solving word in the human predicament of which we were all a part. It is the human biography and God's answering grace. When the Son comes to repent, this one verse that you hear declares loudly the nature of sin. Sin is always antisocial. Before you have I sinned, he says. The prodigal's unruliness brought grief to the father, bitterness to the brother, and cast a shadow on the whole household. For we forget that we are bound by unbreakable ties to the entire human family. And any act is like purification or poison placed in a river. Many of you have heard phrases in our culture, maybe from your children or grandchildren or somewhere out there, like this. Well, as long as I'm not bothering you, as long as I don't hurt you, as long as I'm in my own house, I can do whatever I want. And how quickly we forget that we were all still connected in some way. Of course, sin, as many of us know, is also self-hurt. The sinner sinks in life, almost drowning. But as bad as it is to self-inflict the wounds of sin, which it's pretty bad, and even to yoke those we love into our sphere of sinfulness as well, which is also very bad, neither describes the deepest meaning and effect of sin. When the Son says, against heaven, we hear of sin's real and truest nature. The reality of sin, the real offense, is against God. And against sin we find then this nature and this saving consequence of confession boiling up within him. The prodigal was wise to confess to his father, especially as his father was loving and grace-filled, acting as a conduit for the love and grace of God. But then we hear these other words come from the mouth of the Son. Make me one of your servants. Now perhaps this plea was in humility. Perhaps it was to be an escape. We can't be for sure. But knowing the family story, the prodigal was not born to be a slave. And we must know that a man who can say, I have sinned against heaven, can never be a slave. For in some way they have seen the throne of God. In fact, confess themselves as a child of God, although we are erring and willful children at that. And so God does not drive us or drive the Son like with a whip. Instead, the Father waves aside the plea for servitude. This is my Son, he says. The Father had recognized his Son even in rags, despite the emaciated body from lack of eating and the dejection, the head bent low in shame and tears. We see here how Jesus gives a wonderful pledge in love. He said that while a man was yet a great way off from God, and God sees him, recognizes him for his child, and runs down the road to meet him. Yet, at the same time, it is also a hard love judgment, in fact, for the Father waited for the Son to want to come home before he made his move. He had not gone looking for him. He had, in fact, waited. But then, as soon as the choice was made, the Father went running. And is not Jesus the same who comes running down the road for each one of us? Paul reminds us in Romans 5 that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And this Father, if you can imagine the scene, he didn't just run, he came and smothered his Son in love, in kisses, asking for the best robe reserved for the most distinguished guest, with the rings and the shoe reserved for the heirs and the children of the household. Ooh, and the calf, the fatted calf, I bet that tasted delicious. Reserved only for the very special occasions, bought and brought for the celebratory meal. This Son, having chosen to come home and repent to his Father, is lavished like a prince or a king. Now, I have no doubt, there are a few of us, maybe more of us in this room wondering right now, does the pardon of the Father not seem a little too easy? Did the Son get off? Does God really just say to us when we have destroyed our own lives and poisoned others, just forget about it? I mean, even a sinner like us expects some sort of judgment, right? Some recompense, some trial for what we have done wrong. Where is the holiness of God in this story? Where is the cleansing flame of judgment? Yet we should be reminded that parables aren't always meant to tell the full theological story of God, but more often intended to teach one lesson. And here that truth is that God welcomes sinners. Jesus often stressed this in his teachings and in his life because the publicans and the sinners didn't believe it. Do you? Do you believe that God welcomes sinners? And often Jesus heard from the Pharisees and the scribes because they did not wish to believe it. Do you believe that God welcomes sinners? So was there no judgment in this story? Or do we just not recognize it? Do we expect something more telling and defining, something much more dramatic, fire and brimstone and judgment? Do we not think that the prodigal son did not learn something from his recklessness? Did he not grow somehow from his shameful moments? Do not each one of us carry for life the stories and lessons from the less pleasant moments of our lives? Yes, I think we can see the wisdom and judgment of God in this story. We can see how the Son faced himself and his sins and then turned and sought pardon through forgiveness. In that moment, I have sinned. That journey in hunger and rags and dejection was not painless. Instead, it was cleansing pain. Facing the light is exquisite pain to eyes that have been long closed to selfishness. But I think the father may have grown in pain as well, through the grief he felt every day, wondering how his son was in that far country. His anguish was daily, no doubt, worrying him and keeping him nervous all hours of the day. Would his son survive? Would he come back someday? Does not every one of us here with children and grandchildren worry the same thought? Within this worry, is there not the seed of a lesson in the trust and grace of God? No, this story is not useless or without judgment or hardship. Instead, this is a moment of holy love between the Father and the Son. And the moment of that holy love comes to shine its brightest in the moment of welcome home. And it's more than just mere restoration. Pardon of this type is nothing less than the grandest, most austere, most incredible welcome home you've ever even heard of. So that by the day that the love of home may work into the returned soul himself, eventually he becomes the home of God. The love, the pardon, and the welcome home of the Father are so overwhelming because of the grace and mercy of the Father. And so overwhelming, in fact, the Son who was in many ways dead of soul is now alive. And this is a new thing being done, going from death to life. This, my brothers and sisters, is a godly thing. This is a Jesus thing. For real death only comes when the soul is lost, not the body. And yet we are so afraid of death, aren't we, today? We link death and judgment so often, don't we? We try to disguise death and run from death and hide from death. But for Christians, the word lost is the key to the meaning of death, just as found is the meaning of life. A person is dead only when they are lost to the love of God, and a person is alive when they are found again by God's love. Death into new life can then only result in joy and celebration, as we see in this parable, and rightly so. And yet, in the glory and light of life, some of us were getting excited, and then somebody in here was thinking, wait. We should be reminded that this world often carries a dark side. Charlie, you can't give me all this good news. Bring it down to my level. And from the joy of the rebirth of the prodigal, we find that there is this other son, not quite as joyful. And some of us might be asking, why? Why is he so upset and so ill-tempered? He had remained safely at home, working hard for the family, and was even due his larger portion of the inheritance. But we in the real world need not look far to understand that the child who stays at home can often become overlooked. Status quo, normal, commonplace in life. The son who has disappeared, lost in danger, always on the mind of the parents, finds a special place in their life and their prayers. Not that they are so much loved more, but instead remembered more because of their distance and need. And so the older brother has seemingly grown in resentment over these years, and beyond that, was actually jealous of the joy and welcome his brother received. And not only jealous, but self-righteous, condemning his brother with venomous words about how he had squandered his father's inheritance, and even further, reacting with self-pity, noting the fatted calf had never been sacrificed for him and his work. My brothers and sisters, we should know and be clear that jealousy, self-righteousness, and self-pity come from an inward turning eye, not an outward. And so the elder brother, while pretending to worship God the Father, was in fact his own God. And yet, just when you think that the elder brother is about to ruin the story, and you're like, see, life's terrible, the Father steps in again with patience and mercy and love and a soft response for his angered son. All that I have is yours. Who can doubt this Father's love? So, what in fact does this parable show us and teach us? Well, first, know that perhaps for all these years and generations we have been calling it by the wrong name. Because this son, in fact, is not the hero. Perhaps it should be called instead the parable of the loving father. For it tells us rather about a father's love than a son's sin. And second, it tells us much about the forgiveness of God. The father must have been waiting and watching for the son to come home, for he saw him a long way off. And when he came, he forgave him and loved him with no judgment. You see, in this world, there is a way of forgiving when forgiveness is conferred as a favor. Here you go. I guess I forgive you. It's even worse when someone is forgiven, but always by hint and by word and by threat, the sin is held over you. Some of you been there? Oh, I remember when you did this and that. Once again, we have the amazing truth that it is easier to confess to God than it is to many a man and a woman. That God is more merciful in his judgments than maybe most, if not all, faithful believers. That the love of God is far broader than the love of people, and that God can forgive when humans refuse to. In face of a love like that, we cannot be other than lost in wonder, love, and praise at this story and the love of the Father, which is its core teaching. There's a story told about Abraham Lincoln, who was once asked, how was he going to treat those rebellious Southerners when they had finally been defeated and returned to the Union of the United States? And as a lifelong, generational Northerner, I got ready for this one. The questioner, of course, expected, Lincoln's going to take dire vengeance and destroy them. But Lincoln responded, I will treat them as if they had never been away. It is the wonder of the love of God that he treats us just like that. To our God be the glory forever and ever. Amen.